I was never a huge fan of the original Dying Light. Not because of any underlying factor, the game was actually pretty fun. It was a cool, open world zombie parkour game. But at the time of its release, I was so fatigued with zombie media that I kinda just wrote the game off.
Hey Joe, you wanna play a zombie game?
Sure.
Hey Joe, you wanna play a zombie game?
Oh, okay.
Hey Joe, you wanna play a zombie game?
Jesus Christ, how many fucking zombie games you buying, Joe?
The story was also pretty weak. I look back fondly on that game, but if you asked me like 3 years ago if I thought the game was good enough to get a sequel, I'd call you crazy. Dying Light 2 is a sequel to the critically accepted first game from 2015. I put just under 40 hours into this game, give or take some trips to the can and some hits of the gram. I finished the main quest line and did a number of side quests and open world stuff. I came out of this experience feeling really conflicted on a lot of aspects. In a genre this saturated, I feel these open world narrative games really have to pull their weight to show players something new or worthwhile. Ubisoft games especially have this problem, where the boring and repetitive formula of something like Far Cry really overshadows any superficial additions like a new setting or cockfighting.
I was acting.
So what does this game bring to the table? Let's talk about the open world. In my eyes, what sets apart a good open world from a bad one is the systems that make it unique and force you to interact with the world itself. For example, without the rain, Death Stranding would just be a game about delivering packages. And while Death Stranding is still about that, the rain heavily impacts how you play. It's dynamic, it forces you to make different decisions, and it impacts the story. Dying Light had a system like this with the day-night cycle, where during the day the zombies are quite weak and in small in number. At night they're much more ferocious and plentiful. You're given XP boosters for your efforts during nighttime, making a great risk-reward system. You can also do a GTA-style chase, trying to rack up more and more points without getting caught and killed. The system returns here with some extra benefits. More open-world locations take advantage of this cycle, making certain locations only available during the night, lest you want to deal with a bunch of zombie freaks. I really like this system. It allows for that dynamic emergent gameplay open worlds are best at, and it's pretty good here. When I first started playing, I was pretty happy with how often I was doing side content, but as my playtime grew higher, I started to find the open world stuff kind of boring. There are a lot of reused assets and spaces for the side content. I'm fine with that. Games are a lot of work to make, and shortcuts are necessary to make these things happen. That being said, exploring the same environment over and over just isn't that fun. It doesn't help that the loot you get from these isn't great either. About 20 hours in, I found myself not engaging with much else besides the main story, but I'll get to that later. Another thing that separates the good from the bad in this genre is how you can traverse the world. What good is your open world if the ways you move about it aren't any fun? Needless to say, Dying Light has some of the best parkour I've ever played. Parkour was undoubtedly the best aspect of the first game, so it's great to see how they've not only brought it back, but how much it's improved. If you think this gameplay looks like a lot of fun, that's because it is. Gaining and keeping momentum while the synth music dynamically kicks in and reacts to your speed feels absolutely fantastic to play. It reminds me a lot of the way traversal works in Insomniac's Spider-Man. Like the combat, it has its own upgrade tree, and as you play you will unlock entire new ways of traversal. So through this meaty campaign, you're still receiving massive changes to the formula and gameplay. With how repetitive open world games can start to feel, this is something I really appreciate. Parkouring around is heavily elevated by the animations. A lot of them are contextual, so as your character walks up next to something, he'll prop his arms up next to the wall, or if you're walking across a slim surface, Aiden will raise his arms to balance himself out. In fact, the animations are comparable to something like Red Dead 2, where all the contextual animations have been accounted for. If you think you can grab it, you probably can. This heavily adds to the immersion factor, and I really love when games do this. A lot of people may fight over how looting takes too long, but I am not one of these people. Speaking of fights, Dying Light has some superb melee combat. You will be hard-pressed to find a game with better first-person melee combat than this. The combat takes elements of your parkouring and mixes them into this unique fighting style the first game was known for. There's a real weight to each of your attacks, and with the help of the sound design, it makes the experience all the more immersive. There's a large variety of handheld weapons too. You might think this combat model would be very limited without firearms, but you'd be really surprised. There are class variants and different status effects that a lot of the weapons and clothing items carry. There's a genuine level of diversity here, which I did not expect at all going in. If you're the type of person who loves to customize builds and use all the tools at your disposal, that's a huge amount of this game tailored right for you. I am not this kind of person, not at all. I always kind of play games just getting by on the least of what I need, and the game's combat system is flexible enough to where you can get by without worrying about individual class design bullshit. Slicing up baddies with a knife or beating them with a blunt weapon each feel different enough to keep the weapons feeling unique. Not only that, but there's upgrade systems and modding systems for the weapons. Admittedly, I didn't interact with these much until late in my playthrough, as they don't spice up combat that much. These weapons are very feeble and break very easily. That kind of made me more conservative with my resources, because why would I waste my items to make weapons better for the short period of time I get to use them? The mods only give you 1 or 2 extra opportunities to dish out damage anyway. They get the job done just fine without mods, but the option for some players is there. Where this combat model really suffers though is inside buildings. The combat works so well when you're able to freely parkour around enemies and back off when you need to. It allows you to make decisions on the fly, and it feels so good to play. But inside you aren't afforded the same luxury. Sometimes you'll be stuck in a cramped room with 3 or 4 other guys at once, and since enemies can be pretty aggressive, they'll all corner you and it can make combat feel kind of frustrating, which obviously isn't the intended experience. I'd be mistaken if I didn't mention the zombies, I guess. I mean, that's what this game is about, right? There are zombies here in Dying Light 2, believe it or not. We got the classics, we got Boomer, we got Jockey, we got the Witch. We got the same fucking zombies every game has had since Left 4 Dead. Come on guys, it's been 14 years since Left 4 Dead. And yes, while that is the best zombie game ever made, I don't think it's a lot to ask that a game about zombies has a little more focus on the actual fucking zombies. After you get nearly halfway through the game, the day-night cycle starts to carry a lot less impact and you interact with it a lot less. You'll spend much more time on rooftops and skylines instead of the horde-infested streets below, so the agency of the zombies wears thin very fast, at least for me. During the story, which I'll talk about later, you are given the option to make decisions like in other RPG games that affect the outcome of your playtime. After capturing outposts and other structures in the world, you have the option to delegate those resources to one of the 2 factions running the city. These resources, depending on your choice, heavily impact the sandbox, and adding things like traps or more zip lines around the city to make parkour and combat better. I am really loving this feature. I think it does a lot to improve the playground that the gameplay is built around, and it's all the better for it. Okay, now for performance. I played this game on a NVIDIA RTX 3070 with 8 gigs of video RAM. This is a pretty beefy PC, and I should have no problems playing Dying Light 2. I had issues playing Dying Light 2. In the open world, I got a consistent 60 FPS almost the entire way through. Maybe a few stutters here or there, but that didn't bother me too much, alright? But inside quest hubs or the open world hideouts, absolute nightmare. Every 2 seconds the game freezes up in these spaces and it leads to a really bad stuttering effect. These areas aren't even that dense or populated. There's no reason the game should be running like this. After finicking with some settings and turning on DLSS, it improved for the most part, but I still don't see why the game will struggle at 1080p. That really sucks. As for bugs, it's a whole different story. Where the performance was pretty great about 70% of the time, I couldn't go an hour without seeing at least a few bugs. This doesn't usually bother me in other games, but it was so consistent here, and a lot of instances I could recreate many times over. When it's just minor bugs, I don't really care, but when I start to see the cracks in the system and I can start to manipulate it to my own will, it's a little upsetting. Models clipping, hit detection, issues with the UI. Needless to say, this is a buggy ass game. The cutscenes are especially buggy. Sometimes dialogue loads in too late, sometimes it skips itself halfway through a sentence. It's not great. It's a real shame because the story is really front and center here. These bugs make it really easy to tune out of the story when the game can't even tell it to you properly. The devs have already sent out a new patch to fix some game-breaking bugs among other things, and showed a small roadmap of other improvements to come. I've seen some people try to pass off these criticisms or just ignore it, and while I'm usually inclined to ignore bugs, because fun usually supersedes technical issues for me, this is a $60 game, dude. I don't want Techland to fail. They're clearly passionate developers, but despite its multiple delays, it looks like this game still needed a bit more time in the oven. Until this point, I've given a lot of praise for this game. But I'm really sorry to say this, guys. The story sucks. A lot of this game's marketing was based around the story and the many decisions you could make throughout the campaign. That being said, to me it really failed to deliver on a lot of these promises. The story setup here is that you play as Aiden Caldwell, a guy who got separated from his sister as a child when they were being tested on in a lab, and he's on a journey to find her. There's a lot of setup early on in the story for two opposing factions, and I feel that it never gets proper payoff. Throughout the game, it feels as if the story is building to something, and right when things actually get kind of interesting, the story puts you in a city completely separate from the conflict you just experienced. You check up on those early game characters later on, but by then, it was too little too late. I stopped giving a shit. In fact, after you get to that second city, the game's story is really undone by its own structure. The change in setting really robs you of a lot of your investment from those early hours. I actually saw potential in one or two of these characters, and I was interested in what could happen to them. But no. Then we have to take a backseat to meet some new boring characters with generic names and nothing remotely interesting to say. The other main thing to take me out of the story is the guy running the show, Aiden Maldwell. If I had to compare Aiden to anything, the first thing that comes to mind is Ethan Winters. If you've seen my Resident Evil 8 video, you know I feel like Ethan is a plank of wood. He doesn't add anything to the scenes he's in aside from never shutting up about his one-track motivation to find his family. He also purely asks the questions the player is already thinking. He doesn't feel like a fully realized character. He feels like a tool to drag exposition out of the other boring-ass characters. And while exposition like this is usually fine, these 30 to 40 hour games need something more than the boring action man to carry the story. There are character deaths here, and I'm sorry, but a lot of them felt so unceremonious. If you've played the game, you almost definitely know what I'm talking about. Most of the time these characters are allowed one minute character moment before the game considers that a full character arc and decides to kill them off. We are barely afforded much time to meet these guys, and we're supposed to give a shit when they die? Really? Some of the deaths and character fates are off-screen too. I find this to be a really big factor about why I didn't mesh with this story. This really heavily took me out of the experience. The voice direction here for cutscenes and dialogue is very strong, but that doesn't mean the writing itself is all great. As I've said, these characters are very, very bland. They have little quirks and personality traits, but they all feel so artificial. It's one of those games where the characters all just stand around until the end of time itself, waiting for you to chat with them. Dying Light 2 is a game that tries so hard to rise above other games in its genre, and only ends up being much like the rest. There is some great game here, don't get me wrong. The parkour is the best of its genre. The combat is some of the most fluid and surprisingly in-depth for what it is. But as much as I recommend Dying Light 2, I don't see myself returning to this one for a long while. Look, this is the E3 reveal for Dying Light 2. This is Chris Avallone, narrative designer for the game. Here, he literally opens the reveal of the game talking about the decisions you have to make in the story.
Dying Light 2 will be the first in its genre where your choices have genuine consequences in the game itself. From how it looks, how it plays, to the events that occur, everything in the game world can change based on your decisions. Let's say you choose to carry out the Peacekeeper's orders, one way or another. After this, you will start seeing a significant change in the city as access to the water supply allowed the Peacekeepers to bring stability and develop the area. There's even running water for the people at street level, and that raises their morale and allows you to replenish your energy on the go.
Now, I don't know if I'm crazy, but this is some cyberpunk E3 bullshit right here. None of that is in the game. You can allocate different structures to different factions in the world, but it is absolutely nothing as complex as this. You know, maybe us gamers are the fools for thinking Techland could deliver on that promise. The promise they set at the opening reveal of the fucking game. It's a pipe dream, it's false marketing, and it's wrong. This is what I mean though. Techland is actually an indie game dev studio, which makes the end product look all the more impressive. You can really tell just how passionate they were for this project. But at what point does ambition start to hurt a project? They clearly had big ideas for Dying Light, but the scope becomes so vast that a lot of the game ends up suffering as a result. You could have easily cut off 10 to 15 hours of this game, and I would be much more positive about my time with it. Just like the game's parkour, Dying Light 2 opens akin to a full-on sprint. It introduces you to some decent characters and the beginning of a conflict that could have been interesting, but instead it just trips, stumbles, and falls its way to a really awkward finish. It really pains me to say how much this story kind of blows. I don't want Techland to fail. They're clearly passionate, and they put tons of work into this project. But I don't think the uninspired story, the shady marketing, and the poor technical performance will leave a great memory of this game in my head. Thanks for watching.